It's a case that makes you wonder about the limits of journalism, like where's that line between digging for a story and actually breaking the law?
Yeah.
So we've got 3 news articles here, one from 24.com, one from Caribish Network, and another from Aruba.new.
Okay.
They're all covering this trial. 4 Aruban journalists. They're accused of bribing a police officer to get confidential information.
Right away, what strikes me is how serious this is. These aren't small charges. We're talking active official corruption.
Wow.
Yeah, directly involved in corrupting an official. And then there's complicity in violation of official secrets, meaning they were trying to get information illegally. And the big one, they're accused of being part of a criminal organization.
Yeah, those are some serious accusations. We're talking potential prison time for these guys.
Exactly.
And the journalists, their names are Richard Lickel, Brian Kuhlman, Norman Giel, and Nelson Andrade.
It's amazing these sources go into such detail about the allegations. Like the police officer, Robert Voss, he had laptops linked to police radios in his house.
It's like something you'd see in a movie, right?
I know, imagine journalists just listening in.
And it wasn't a few calls. Investigators found 9,000 recorded conversations on one laptop.
That's an insane amount of access. You have to wonder about the potential for abuse with that kind of information.
It's all those sensitive things the police talk about, right? Ongoing investigations, names, even their plans. It's a lot of power to have.
It is. And it sounds like they weren't just listening passively either.
Yeah, the sources talk about how they were keeping Officer Voss happy, like donating to his son's baseball team. And there are allegations of payments of 1,500 florins each month.
It gives off a very transactional vibe, doesn't it? It's less about real journalism and more about buying access.
It crosses the line, for sure.
It does.
Now, of course, the journalists are fighting back. They're claiming wider freedoms for news gathering and saying they're not responsible for what the officer did.
Right. Their argument is that it was the officer's job to uphold the law, not theirs.
Right.
It's an interesting point, actually. It gets at that tension between the public's need to know things and how far journalists can go to get that information.
Yeah, how aggressive can you be?
Sometimes you have to push to find the truth, but when do you go too far? Is it okay to say it's not your problem if your source breaks the law?
Well, the prosecution isn't buying it. They're adamant that journalists still have to operate within the law, regardless of how important the story might seem. They're also focusing on the risk to the privacy of everyday people in Aruba.
And it is a strong argument. Think about it. Thousands of private conversations recorded, potentially leaked. It doesn't feel good to think about your own conversations being out there.
You've got victims, witnesses, maybe even just regular people caught up in it.
It's a nightmare for privacy.
And here's another thing. Everyone's focusing on the journalists, but we have to look at the police officer's role too. Robert Vos, he was already convicted in another trial. Got 16 months, part of it suspended, and he can't be a police officer for 3 years.
That's important because it shows this is being taken very seriously. They're not messing around with the consequences.
Right.
But it makes you think about Vos, too. What was his motivation? Was he corrupt? Was he looking for extra cash? Or was it more?
That's what intrigues me. This setup with the laptops, the radios. Did he come up with it? Were the journalists more involved than they're saying?
It feels like we're missing some pieces of the puzzle. We see what happened, a massive leak, but what caused it all? What were the forces at play?
It almost feels like there's a bigger story, something beyond just these charges.
It's a reminder that even seemingly straightforward cases can have hidden complexities, agendas we may never fully understand.
It really makes you think. What do you think the wider implications are for journalism as a whole? Not just in Aruba, but everywhere.
It raises some really uncomfortable questions, like,
Right.
Are we seeing more aggressive tactics as information becomes more and more valuable?
Are journalists being pushed to cross lines to get those big stories first?
And are we, the people reading the news, are we part of the problem? Do we reward the sensational stuff over the responsible reporting?
I hadn't thought of it that way.
It's something to consider. We talk about the public's right to know, but what about the right to privacy? Where's the balance? This case really forces us to think about those trade-offs.
And doesn't it hurt public trust when journalists break the law for a story? Will people start questioning everything they read?
It's a slippery slope. We depend on journalists to hold powerful people accountable, to expose the bad stuff, to help us understand the world.
Right.
But if they lose our trust, if we think they're no better than the corrupt people they're reporting on, then we all lose.
Okay, so we've gone over the basics, the charges, the arguments from both sides. But I think it's time to look closer at the relationships involved. We've got journalists, a police officer, And maybe even bigger groups involved, lots of players, each with their own goals.
Yeah, and it's not a level playing field. Journalists often go up against powerful people, powerful institutions. It's like David and Goliath.
I like that analogy.
So how did that power imbalance play out here? Did it affect the choices made by the journalists, by the officer?
Exactly, because it's not just did they break the law, it's why did they do it? What were the pressures, the motivations?
Were they really in control or were they being used? We'll dig into those questions after the break. It makes you think about what drives someone to become an investigative journalist like Nelson Speed Andrade, especially one known for pushing the limits.
Yeah, the sources definitely paint him as a bit of a, I don't know, a maverick. Always chasing the big story, thriving on breaking news first.
That ambition, that drive, it's what makes a good investigative journalist. You need that personality to really dig deep, challenge authority, but it can be risky.
Yeah, and as we're seeing, that ambition can lead you down a bad path. Being tenacious is one thing, but breaking the law is another.
Exactly, and that's where the ethics come in.
Yeah.
Where do you draw that line?
Right.
Is it okay to bend the rules a bit if you think it'll expose something really bad? Or does that just hurt everyone?
Hurt the whole profession.
Exactly.
The sources hint that maybe for Andrade, it wasn't just about truth. There's a mention of him being connected to Terra Group, the company that owns 24 Aura. So maybe there was a corporate agenda. Were they pushing for the sensational stuff to get more viewers? Even if it meant looking the other way when things got unethical.
It's possible. We've seen it happen before in these big media scandals. That pressure to get the big headlines, it can lead to bad choices. So were these journalists really independent, or were they pawns in someone else's game?
And what about the other journalists involved? Richard Leclerc, Brian Kuhlman, Norben Giel. What were their motivations? Were they all in on this with Andrade, or did they get caught up in something they couldn't get out of?
It's hard to know the team dynamics without being there. Maybe they were all ambitious, all wanted to break the story, but maybe some of them felt pressured, like they had to go along with Andrade even if they had doubts.
Yeah, that pressure to fit in, especially in a competitive field like news. Nobody wants to be the one who backs down from a big story, even if it means compromising what they believe in.
That's right. And it really shows how important it is to have strong ethics, a culture of accountability in newsrooms. It can't just be on the individual journalist to always make the right choice.
They need support, guidance.
From their editors, their colleagues, the whole organization. So now let's talk about the other big player, Robert Voss, the officer who gave them the information. What was going on with him?
Well, the sources talk about his money problems. Donations to his kid's baseball team, regular payments, even his bar tabs being covered. It seems like he was getting a lot for his cooperation.
Was it just about the money, though? Or was there something more?
Maybe he was unhappy at work, felt overlooked.
It happens. Sometimes people in authority turn against their own institutions. Maybe they're resentful, want revenge, or they think they're doing some greater good by exposing bad stuff from the inside.
Or maybe the journalist took advantage of him, played on his weaknesses, like needing money or wanted to feel important. It's scary to think about that kind of exploitation.
And power dynamics are tricky. It's not always about force or threats. Sometimes it's more subtle, coercion, persuasion, playing on someone's emotions.
And we can't rule out that maybe Voss really thought he was doing the right thing, exposing police corruption, helping to catch criminals, even if it meant breaking the rules.
The classic ends justify the means argument.
It's something you see a lot in these cases of corruption. People convince themselves they're serving a greater good, even if they have to do bad things to get there. It makes you realize how complicated people are.
Right. Our motivations are messy, contradictory. Sometimes we don't even understand them ourselves. And in a case like this, with so much at stake, it's even more important to really look at those motivations.
Because if we understand why people do things, we get a clearer picture of the whole situation. It's not just good guys and bad guys. It's about understanding power, ambition, how people can be capable of good and bad things.
Exactly. So we've talked about the journalist, the police officer, but what about Aruba as a whole? What was the impact on the community?
I imagine it was pretty shocking. This wasn't just some random crime. It was a real breach of trust. People depend on the media to tell them what's happening and the police to keep them safe. And suddenly it seems like both of those institutions were compromised.
Exactly. That kind of thing can make people cynical, distrustful. And when people don't trust institutions, it can hurt the whole society.
So, if people stop trusting the media, they might not pay attention to the news anymore, right?
Right. They might not hold their leaders accountable. And if they don't trust the police, they might not report crimes or help with investigations.
I don't feel safe.
Exactly. It's a dangerous cycle. This case shows how important transparency and accountability are. When trust is broken, it's hard to get it back. The sources mention that this case caused a big debate in Aruba about how much freedom the press should have. Some people thought the journalist went way too far, that they betrayed the public's trust. Others defended them, saying they were just doing their job, holding powerful people accountable. What do you think about that?
Oh, that's a tough one. It's complicated, you know. On the one hand, a free press is so important for a democracy. Journalists have a right, even a responsibility to investigate things and report on what's important for the public. But there are limits.
Legal and ethical limits.
Right. And those are there for a reason. To protect people's rights, make sure things are fair, keep the justice system working properly. It seems like this case really forced Aruba to think about those big questions. Where's the line between good journalism and breaking the law? How do you balance the public's need to know with keeping things private and protecting the police? And maybe the biggest question, how do you rebuild trust